The water dipper trembled in Lin Wei's hand, not from fear, but from the summer heat that had pressed down on the Bar S ranch for 11 straight days without mercy. She had seen the stranger stumble through the east pasture gate an hour before noon, boots dragging, coat torn at the shoulder, a man walking on nothing but stubbornness. Ranch hands were not supposed to leave their posts for wandering strangers, but Lin Wei set down the feed bucket she carried, crossed the yard before anyone could tell her not to, and pressed the dipper of well water into his cracked hands before he could even ask for it. She was 22 years old, the only Chinese woman working the Bar S, hired 2 summers back when Foreman Otis Vance needed hands willing to do the work no one else wanted, and pay was thin enough that pride went with it. She wore a plain gray prairie dress that had faded almost silver from repeated washing, sleeves rolled to the elbow, sun browning her arms in a way the other hands' wives whispered about behind gloved fingers. She had learned, in 2 years on that ranch, that survival meant working twice as hard and speaking half as much as anyone else. She had not learned, until that particular July afternoon, that one act of kindness could cost her everything she had built. The stranger drank slow, careful sips, the way a man drinks who has gone a long stretch without water and knows better than to shock his own stomach. When he finally looked up at her, his eyes were the pale gray of a storm still building over distant hills, and there was something in the set of his jaw that did not match the dust and sweat covering the rest of him. "Obliged," he said, voice rough as gravel. "Been 3 days since I found a well that wasn't dry." "There's bread in my apron if you want it," Lin Wei said, already reaching for the small cloth bundle she kept for her own midday meal. "Cook won't miss it." She did not know his name yet. She did not know that giving a stranger bread and water on the Bar S ranch would, within the hour, unravel 2 years of careful, silent survival, and that the man drinking from her dipper owned more land in 3 territories than Otis Vance had ever dreamed of managing in his lifetime. Otis Vance found them by the well before Lin Wei had finished wrapping the bread. He came at a half run, hat already off his head the way a man removes his hat when he intends to shout, and the sight of him crossing the yard sent a cold feeling straight through Lin Wei's chest, even before he spoke a single word. "What in the blazes do you think you're doing?" Vance said, loud enough that 2 hands mending fence near the barn turned to watch. "You left your post to feed some drifter off the road." "He needed water, Mr. Vance," Lin Wei said, keeping her voice level even as her pulse hammered. "A man near collapsing in this heat. I couldn't just walk past him." "You don't get paid to decide who walks onto this property and who don't," Vance said, stepping close enough that Lin Wei could smell the whiskey already on his breath, though it wasn't yet noon. "This is Mr. Sutter's land, and I run it the way he wants it run, and I don't recall either of us saying you had leave to hand out our provisions to strangers." The stranger set down the dipper slowly, and something shifted in his posture that Lin Wei almost missed, a straightening of the shoulders that had nothing to do with exhaustion anymore. "The bread was hers," he said quietly. "Came from her own portion, not the ranch store's." Vance did not even look at him. "Nobody asked you," he said, and then turned back to Lin Wei with the particular contempt of a man who had never once had to justify his own cruelty to anyone. "Pack your things. I've had enough of your kind thinking they can do as they please on land that ain't theirs. You're off this ranch by sundown." Lin Wei felt the ground shift beneath her, though she did not let her face show it. 2 years of wages saved in careful stacks under a loose floorboard. 2 years of learning every fence line and every difficult mare on this ranch. Gone in the space of 1 sentence, delivered by a man too drunk before noon to remember his own instructions from the week before. "Mr. Vance," she started. "Sundown," Vance said again, and walked away without waiting for her to finish, leaving her standing at the well with a stranger she had known for less than 10 minutes, and a future that had just collapsed as completely as the water dipper now trembling again in her hand. The stranger watched Vance's retreating back for a long moment before he spoke. "That was unjust," he said, simple and flat, no theater in it. "You lost your position over an act of ordinary decency." "It's not the first unjust thing that's happened on this ranch," Linway said, and began coiling the rope she'd left by the trough, hands moving through the motion out of habit rather than purpose now. "Won't be the last either. Not to me." "What's your name?" the man asked. "Linway." She did not offer more. Names, in her experience, were currency best spent carefully. "Daniel," the stranger said. "Daniel Whitam." He said it plainly, without any weight attached, and Linway had no reason yet to know that the name belonged to a man who held title to more grazing land across 3 territories than any other rancher west of the Mississippi. All she saw was a tired traveler in a torn coat, grateful for water, standing uselessly by while her livelihood came apart in front of him. By sundown, Linway had gathered what little belonged to her into a single canvas bag, 2 changes of clothing, a small tin of savings she pried up from beneath the floorboard, and a folding knife her father had carried west from San Francisco before fever took him 3 winters back. She walked out past the bunkhouse with her chin level, refusing to give the watching hands the satisfaction of tears, though her throat ached with the effort of holding them back. Daniel Whitam was waiting by the gate, his coat brushed clean of trail dust though it remained torn at the shoulder, a borrowed horse standing saddled beside him. "I can't offer you your position back," he said as she approached. "That's not mine to offer. But I can offer you passage and work if you're willing to travel 2 days west to my own holdings." Linway studied him carefully, weighing the offer the way she weighed every offer a man had made her in the 2 years since her father's death, with the assumption that kindness rarely came without a hidden cost attached. "What kind of work?" she said. "Honest work," Daniel said. "I run cattle on land that stretches further than you've likely seen in one look. I need hands who know horses and don't flinch from hard labor, and you struck me as someone who fits both descriptions inside of 10 minutes. "You don't know anything about me beyond a dipper of water," Linway said. "I know you gave a stranger your own bread while your foreman watched, and dared him to say something about it," Daniel said. "That tells me more than most conversations would." She did not trust him yet, not fully, but the alternative was walking the road alone with no destination and a tin of savings that would not last the season. She climbed onto the second horse he had somehow arranged, and they rode west together as the summer sun dropped low and orange behind the hills, and it was not until they crested a ridge 2 days later that Linway understood exactly how far she had underestimated the man she had helped. The Whitam ranch spread before them like something out of a dream too large to hold, fence lines running to the horizon in every direction, a main house of white clapboards standing 3 stories against a sky gone gold with the evening light. Linway pulled her horse up short, staring, understanding arriving in a cold wash that made her stomach drop. "This is yours," she said. It was not a question. "It is," Daniel said, watching her reaction with an expression she could not fully read. "I should have told you sooner. I wasn't certain how you'd react to knowing." "You let me think you were a drifter," Linway said, anger rising fast and sharp beneath the shock. "You let Vance humiliate me while you stood there and said nothing, and the whole time you could have stopped it with one word." I could have, Daniel admitted, and had the grace to look genuinely uncomfortable saying it. But a man in my position rarely gets to see how people treat a stranger who has nothing to offer them. I have learned more about Otis Vance's character in 1 hour by that well than I would have learned in a year of doing business with him through letters and lawyers. Linway's jaw tightened, torn between fury at having been used, even unknowingly, as part of some test, and the plain fact that his account of events was true. "And what did you learn about me?" she said. "That you don't calculate the cost of kindness before you offer it," Daniel said quietly. "That's rarer than you'd think, in this territory or any other." She did not answer him immediately, guiding her horse forward instead toward the enormous house, working through what it meant that the man she'd helped without a second thought controlled more land and wealth than she had ever imagined standing this close to in her life. The following week settled into a rhythm that surprised Linway with how ordinary it felt, despite the extraordinary scale of everything around her. Daniel put her to work training horses in the West Corral, a task she took to with an ease that drew attention from ranch hands who had not expected a woman, let alone a Chinese woman fresh off another ranch's dismissal, to handle animals with such quiet, sure confidence. She noticed Daniel watching from the fence line more often than strictly necessary, and though he rarely spoke more than a few words at a time, she began to understand that his silence was not indifference, but a kind of careful attention most men never bothered to give. It was the ranch's segundo, a broad-shouldered man named Silas Bishop, who first tested how far the other hands would accept her presence. 3 weeks into her work at the Whitam ranch, Silas cornered her near the tack room, his voice pitched low enough that Daniel, working horses 50 yards distant, would not hear it. "Don't matter what favor the boss thinks he owes you," Silas said, arms crossed, blocking her path to the door. "Folks around here don't take kindly to outsiders getting handed opportunities that decent, hard-working men have waited years for." "I didn't ask to be handed anything," Linway said, refusing to step back though her pulse quickened. "I work the same hours you do, and my horses come out of that corral calmer than half the ones you've broken yourself." Silas's face darkened at that, and for a moment Linway thought he might do something rash, his hand twitching toward the tack room wall, as though considering blocking her path more forcefully. But before he could act, one of the young mares in the near stall spooked hard against her stall door, the sound sharp enough to draw both their attention, and Linway moved past him without another word, crossing to calm the animal with the same steady hands that had first caught Daniel Whitcomb's attention by that well 200 miles east. Silas watched her go, jaw set, but said nothing further, and word of the confrontation reached Daniel by supper regardless. Daniel found her that evening at the corral fence, the sky behind him bruised purple with the last of the light, and he did not raise the subject gently. "Silas gave you trouble today," he said. "I want to hear it from you before I hear it filtered through anyone else." Linway considered deflecting, telling him it was nothing, the way she had learned to minimize every slight in 2 years of surviving on land that was never truly hers to claim. But something about the plain directness of his question made her answer honestly instead. "He doesn't think I've earned my place here," she said. "He's not entirely wrong to wonder. I arrived because you handed me an opportunity, not because I fought my way to it the way the rest of your hands did." "You fought your way here the moment you crossed that yard with a dipper of water while your own foreman watched and dared you not to," Daniel said, his voice sharper than she'd heard it before. "Silas will learn to see that, or he'll find work somewhere that suits his opinions better." "Don't dismiss him on my account," Linway said. "I can handle Silas Bishop." "I don't doubt that," Daniel said, and something in the way he looked at her then made her breath catch, unexpected and unwelcome given how carefully she had guarded herself against exactly this kind of feeling. "But I find I don't much care for watching anyone treat you the way Vance did. Once was enough for one lifetime." She studied his face in the fading light, searching for the calculation she assumed must exist somewhere beneath a wealthy man's sudden concern for a hired hand's dignity, and found instead something that looked uncomfortably close to sincerity. "Why does it matter to you?" she asked. "What Silas thinks, what Vance did? I'm one hand among dozens on your land." "You're not," Daniel said simply, and did not elaborate further, though the words settled into her chest with a weight that lingered long after he had walked back toward the main house, leaving her alone at the corral fence with the horses and the darkening sky, and a feeling she did not yet have a name for. In the days after that confrontation with Silas, Daniel began finding small reasons to work near the West Corral himself, mending a section of fence that did not strictly need mending, checking hoof soundness on horses he had already inspected the week before. Linway noticed, though she said nothing of it, and found herself, against every instinct honed by 2 years of guarded survival, watching for him in return. It was during one of those afternoons, both of them coated in dust and sweat from gentling a particularly stubborn gelding, that Daniel told her something about the horse operation he had not mentioned before. "My father lost his own ranch to a man who filed a false survey and paid a territorial clerk to look the other way," he said, working a burr loose from the gelding's mane with careful fingers. "I was younger than you are now. I watched him ride into town every week for 2 years trying to get a fair hearing, and every week he came home a little more beaten down by men who smiled while they robbed him blind." He paused, glancing at her. "That's why I built this operation the way I did. Every hand paid fair, every claim recorded twice over with the territorial office, every horse accounted for by name. I did not want anyone under my employ to ever wonder whether the ground beneath them was as solid as it looked." Linway considered that, turning it over the way she turned over most things Daniel told her, searching less for hidden motive now, and more for the shape of the man underneath the wealth. "That's not how most men who own land like this behave," she said. "Most men who own land like this have never lost everything to someone smiling at them while they did it," Daniel said simply. "I have. It changes how a person builds afterward." The gelding settled fully under both their hands, and for a moment neither of them spoke, the quiet between them comfortable in a way Linway had not expected to find on land this vast, with a man whose name carried more weight across 3 territories than she had ever imagined standing this close to. It was a small moment, unremarkable to anyone watching from the bunkhouse windows, but it settled something in her that the danger and the suspicion of the following weeks would not manage to shake loose again. The trouble that followed came from a direction neither of them expected, though in hindsight Linway would understand it had been building for weeks. A neighboring rancher named Reginald Foss, whose grazing land bordered the Whitam holdings on the southern edge, had spent years contesting a stretch of disputed range that both men claimed under conflicting surveys, filed a decade apart. Foss was a man who smiled easily and spoke softly, the kind of politeness that Linway had learned, through hard experience, to distrust more than open hostility. He arrived at the Whitcomb ranch on a hot August afternoon, with 2 of his own hands trailing behind him, ostensibly to discuss the boundary dispute, though his eyes lingered on Linway working the corral with an interest that had nothing to do with cattle survey lines. "Didn't realize you'd taken to hiring outsiders for your finer work, Whitcomb," Foss said, loud enough to carry, his tone pleasant in a way that made the words land harder than any shout could have. Must be getting difficult finding decent hands willing to work for a man so stubborn about a fence line that clearly belongs to false land. The survey belongs to neither of us until the territorial office settles it, Daniel said evenly, though Lin Wei noticed his jaw had tightened at the deliberate insult aimed her direction. And who I hire is not a matter open for your opinion, Reginald. Just an observation, Foss said, still smiling, still pleasant. And that was when Lin Wei understood exactly what Daniel's rules had meant about polite men being the most dangerous ones in any room. Foss's gaze slid toward her one more time before he mounted his horse to leave. You'd do well to remember, Whitcomb, that a man's choices reflect on more than just himself out here. Folks talk. Reputation matters more than range rights some seasons. The threat, dressed in courtesy, hung in the air long after Foss and his hands had ridden off toward the disputed southern boundary, and Lin Wei found herself standing very still by the corral fence, understanding with sudden clarity that her presence on this ranch had become a weapon Foss intended to use against Daniel, one way or another, before the season's end. That night, unable to settle her thoughts enough to sleep, Lin Wei walked out past the bunkhouse toward the small rise overlooking the western pasture, where the summer air had finally cooled enough to breathe easy. She found Daniel already there, sitting on an overturned water barrel, hat off, staring out at land that stretched further than the eye could follow even in daylight. He did not seem surprised when she approached. Foss will use the boundary dispute as an excuse, Daniel said, before she had spoken a word. But that's not really what troubles him. Men like Reginald Foss have never known what to do with a woman who works harder and thinks faster than most of the hands he's ever hired. And it unsettles something in him that he can't put a name to. So he reaches for the only weapon he understands: reputation, gossip, the threat of shame. I've spent my whole life being that unsettling thing to men like him, Lin Wei said, sitting on the grass a careful distance away, though closer than strict propriety might have suggested.
My father used to say that in this territory, a person survives by being useful enough that folks forget to ask what they are before they ask what they can do. It worked, mostly, until it didn't. Tell me about him, Daniel said. Your father. Lin Wei was quiet for a long moment, turning the request over, unaccustomed to anyone asking about her life before this ranch, with genuine interest rather than idle curiosity. He came west in the gold years, worked a rail lines through the Sierras when the work near killed half the men who took it, she said finally. He always said the mountains didn't care what a man's name was, only whether he could swing a hammer straight. He wanted that same fairness everywhere else, and mostly never found it. Fever took him 3 winters back, on a stretch of land he'd never gotten to call his own. And you've been finding your own way since, Daniel said. It was not a question. I've been surviving since, Lin Wei corrected. There's a difference, I think, between surviving and finding your way. I'm not certain I've done the second one yet. Daniel was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke again, his voice had dropped into something rougher, more unguarded than she had heard from him before. I built this ranch out of a debt I owed my own father, who lost everything he'd built to men exactly like Reginald Foss, men who smiled while they took what wasn't theirs. I told myself for years that if I built something large enough, sturdy enough, no one would ever be able to do to me what was done to him. He looked at her directly then, something raw moving behind his gray eyes. I did not expect that building all this would leave me standing here, wealthier than most men in 3 territories, and still feeling like the loneliest man on this land until a woman with a dipper of water walked into my life by accident. Lin Wei's breath caught, the confession landing with a weight she had not braced herself to receive.
"That's a dangerous thing to admit to a hired hand," she said quietly, though there was no real defense in her voice, only honesty meeting honesty. "Perhaps," Daniel said, "but I find I'm tired of calculating every word before I say it, at least where you're concerned." Neither of them moved to close the remaining distance between them that night, though something had shifted permanently in the space between them, an honesty exchanged that neither could take back. Lin Wei walked back to the bunkhouse alone under a sky thick with summer stars, carrying his words with her the way she once carried her father's advice, turning them over and over, searching for the trap she had learned to expect in every kindness offered to her, and finding, for the first time in longer than she could remember, none at all. The trouble Reginald Foss had promised arrived 8 days later, not as gossip or whispered reputation, but as fire. Lin Wei woke to the smell of smoke thick in the night air and the sound of shouting rolling across the yard, and by the time she reached the corral, flames were already climbing the dry timber of the western hay barn, orange light throwing long, shaking shadows across the panicked faces of ranch hands scrambling for water buckets that could never move fast enough against a blaze that size. Daniel was already there, directing hands toward the horses trapped in the adjoining stalls, his voice cutting through the chaos with the same steady control she had come to recognize in him. "The horses first!" Daniel shouted. "The barn's already lost!" Lin Wei did not wait to be told twice. She ran toward the stalls where 3 mares were screaming against the smoke, their hooves striking the wooden stall doors in blind panic, and she moved through the heat and choking air with a calm born of 2 years spent reading frightened animals before they could hurt themselves or anyone near them. She threw open the first stall door, grabbing the lead rope hanging just inside, and pulled the mare's head down close to her own so the animal could smell her instead of only the fire. "Easy," she said, low and steady, though her own lungs burned with smoke. "Easy now. This way." She got 2 of the 3 mares clear before Silas Bishop, of all people, appeared at her side to wrestle the third free, coughing hard but moving with a determination that surprised her, given the tension that had sat between them for weeks. "Don't thank me yet," Silas managed between coughs, hauling the last mare toward open air. "Still think you got handed things you didn't earn, but nobody deserves to burn for it." The barn collapsed in on itself 20 minutes later, a total loss, but every horse inside had made it out alive, and as the ranch hands worked through the remaining hours of darkness to contain the last of the flames from spreading toward the main house, Daniel found the evidence that told him everything he needed to know about how the fire had started. A lantern, its glass shattered deliberately, rather than by accident, lying just inside the barn's side entrance, the kind of lantern that belonged to no one on the Whitam payroll. "Foss," Daniel said the next morning, standing over the wreckage with the ruined lantern in his hand, his voice carrying a controlled fury that Lin Wei had not yet seen from him. "He couldn't win the boundary dispute through the territorial office, so he decided to burn me into submission instead." "You don't know that for certain," Lin Wei said, though she suspected, as much as he did, exactly who was responsible. "I know enough," Daniel said. He rode out that same afternoon to the territorial marshal's office 2 days distant, carrying the shattered lantern and 2 witnesses among his hands who had seen Foss's men riding the boundary line the night of the fire. And though the legal proceedings that followed took the better part of 6 weeks to resolve, the outcome, when it finally arrived, left Reginald Foss stripped of his claim to the disputed southern range entirely, the territorial office ruling decisively in the Whitam favor once evidence of the arson came fully to light. Foss sold his remaining holdings within the month and left the territory altogether. His reputation, the very weapon he had once threatened to use against Daniel, now the thing that had finally ruined him. In the weeks following the fire, something between Linway and Daniel had settled into a certainty neither of them tried any longer to deny or explain away with careful reasoning. He found her most evenings at the same rise overlooking the western pasture, and the conversations that had once been careful and guarded grew easier, filled with the kind of honesty that comes only after two people have pulled each other through real danger together. It was there, on a cooling evening in late August, with the rebuilt barn's fresh timber pale against the darkening sky, that Daniel finally said the thing neither of them had allowed themselves to say plainly before. "I've built more land and more wealth than any 10 men could reasonably need," he said, turning the brim of his hat slowly between his hands. "And none of it meant anything close to what it means now. Watching you pull those horses clear of a burning barn with your own 2 hands, and asking for nothing in return." He looked at her directly. "I'm not offering you a position on this ranch anymore, Linway. I'm asking you to stay as something else entirely, if you'll have me." Linway felt something loosen in her chest that had been tightly wound since the day her father died on land that was never truly his, a feeling she did not immediately have words for beyond the certainty that she did not want to be anywhere else. "I came to this territory with nothing but a knife my father carried west, and a belief that hard work was the only currency that mattered," she said. "I did not expect to find a man willing to see past everything the rest of this territory taught me to hide." "Is that a yes?" Daniel said, something almost unguarded in his voice now, closer to hope than the careful control she had come to know from him. "It's a yes," Linway said, and when he reached for her hand this time, she did not pull away. 3 months later, the small clapboard church at the edge of the territorial township stood filled near to its rafters, an unusual gathering for a wedding that half the county had whispered about since the announcement first spread. Linway stood at the front of that church in a dress far finer than any prairie gray she had ever owned, her father's folding knife tucked carefully into a small pouch at her waist, a private tribute to the man who had not lived to see this day, but whose lessons about hard work and quiet dignity had carried her every step toward it. Daniel waited for her at the altar, gray eyes steady in a way that had nothing to do with storms anymore and everything to do with certainty. The ranch hands who had once eyed her with suspicion filled the pews alongside neighbors and territorial officials who had learned, over the preceding months, that the Whitam holdings under Linway's growing influence in the horse operations had become the most productive stretch of grazing land in 3 counties. Silas Bishop sat near the front, having become, in the months since the fire, something closer to a genuine friend than either of them would have predicted that first tense afternoon by the tack room. The preacher spoke the vows plainly, without excessive ceremony, the way frontier weddings were conducted in a territory more concerned with practical partnership than elaborate display, and when Daniel finally kissed his new wife in front of the gathered township, the applause that followed carried none of the whispered judgment that had once followed Linway across the Bar S ranch yard. In the seasons that followed, the Whitam ranch grew larger still, its horse operations, now run jointly by Linway with an authority no one questioned any longer, becoming known throughout the territory for producing the calmest, most reliable stock available west of the Mississippi. Otis Vance, the foreman who had once dismissed her by sundown for the crime of ordinary kindness, found himself quietly let go from the Bar S within the year, his employer having grown weary of the reputation for cruelty that followed him even after Linway's departure. She never sought revenge against him, never spoke his name with anything more than plain fact when it came up at all, understanding better than most that the truest answer to injustice was simply to build a life too solid and too honest for anyone's small cruelty to touch again. Lin Wei kept the water dipper from that first afternoon, the very one that had trembled in her hand by the well, hung now on a nail inside the doorway of the new barn built to replace the one lost to fire, a small, unremarkable object that neither of them ever felt the need to explain to visitors who noticed it. It was enough for the two of them to know what it represented. A single act of ordinary decency, offered without calculation to a stranger who needed water more than he needed to be believed, had rearranged the whole of both their lives into something neither could have predicted, standing in that dusty ranch yard under a merciless July sun. And that brings us to the end of this one. If you stayed with me all the way through, thank you. Stories like this only get told because folks like you sit down and listen. If you liked what you heard, go ahead and hit that like button, and if you want more stories from the old frontier, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Until then, take care of yourself, and thanks again for being here.